welcome to this mini lesson on the witches in Macbeth, plus Hecate, who is the main witch, the kind of high priestess of witches. So we're going to just be looking at these characters and breaking down different aspects of how you can talk about them and different key points about them. So all of these are things that you could use to make paragraphs in your essays. All of these are really good for character-focused based essay questions. So the kind of question that says, how do the witches, do this or that in Macbeth? So how do they link to a particular theme? How do they express the supernatural? Or how do they manipulate the characters? Or how do they create evil? Or are they important? All those kinds of questions, which I'm sure you've come across or practiced, or most of you will have seen already. This kind of lesson is going to just quick fire your brain in terms of thinking about different ways we can explore these characters. So I want you to write down anything that you don't know already about the witches, and I want you to write down ideas and interpretations of their character. So maybe if you find different debating points, like some people might say that they're really important to the story, some people might say that they're actually background characters and they're not so important. Those kinds of things where there's a tension or a disagreement are really good for essays, and they help you achieve those really top levels. So make sure you address those discrepancies if you find any while we're going through the lesson. So hopefully you enjoyed the lesson, and I think the witches are my favourite characters. I always switch around with Macbeth because I like all of them really, but I love the witches, so hopefully you'll enjoy this lesson as much as me. So we're going to start, and let's start. So they always appear on stage together as a group of three. This is important because they're kind of like, they're called Instruments of Darkness by Banquo. That's a good quote to remember if you don't know it already. And they sort of channel evil. And 3 is sort of considered a magic number. It's perhaps a witchy number. So that's probably why Shakespeare did this whole group of 3 thing. But there's this also really kind of ancient texts like classical literature, like ancient Greek or Roman literature. They have this idea of the 3 fates, which are these 3 women who hold the thread of life for each individual human on Earth, and then when that human's time is up, they cut the thread, so they kill the human, and they've got your fate in their hands, literally. So it comes from the idea of the 3 fates as well, which is a good context point to write down if you didn't know that already. And feel free to research that further because it's really fascinating. The connection between the 3 fates and the witches. If you've ever seen Disney's Hercules, they have the fates in that, so that's what those guys are. And and the 3 witches are a parallel for those. So they always appear on stage together, and they appear in really kind of dark supernatural settings. So they're really connected to their surroundings, and it's important to make that as a point in an essay. So they're out on the heath, on the moorland, in the first scene of the whole play, which is where we meet them. And then they're also there when they first encounter Macbeth, 2 scenes later. So Act 1, Scene 1, 1.1, and Act 1, Scene 3, 1.3. So then they also appear in a dark cave with a cauldron in 4.1. So they switch from being outside in the open to in this kind of hidden, dark, sort of misty setting, stirring this cauldron. And Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft, she suggests to them to meet Macbeth there and to prepare a spell to trick him further. So that's why they stop being on the moor and they actually go into this cave. And it's suggested that it's actually a cave of hell as well. So Macbeth kind of arguably meets them in physical hell at that point, like he's getting drawn deeper and deeper into the idea of his doom. They seem able to control elements, so they talk about creating a storm to create a shipwreck, and they say that they're going to meet in thunder, lightning, or rain. So what kind of atmosphere is around them affects the work that they do, and they're really connected to that. And we call that pathetic fallacy. I'm going to actually write that down as a technique. Make sure that you can confidently talk about this technique, because it's considered quite a high level thing to be able to talk about pathetic fallacy. So they appear in female form, but they're not necessarily women. So Banquo says, "You should be women, yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so," which means you look like you're meant to be women, but you have beards and you kind of freak me out, and I'm not really sure what you are. So they appear in female form, but they are also unnatural. And if you've had a look at the Lady Macbeth lesson in this course, you'll notice that she's slightly similar. She doesn't look unnatural, but she acts unnaturally for her gender. So, in the same way, the witches act unnaturally for their gender. And there's a sense of uncanniness being created. Uncanniness is when you're sort of scared of something because it seems familiar, but then it also sort of tricks you and seems not quite like what you expect. So, like a clown that's not funny but evil is uncanny because we expect clowns to be funny. So, in the same way, these witches look like women, but then they have beards, and they seem feminine, but then they sort of are also supernatural and kind of evil. So it creates this uncanniness, which is a really good keyword to use in essays. So a really good side point as well, that's a context point, and you can look more at my context lesson for more detail on this, but all of actors in Shakespeare's time had to be played by men, so it wasn't an appropriate role for a woman to play. So what that means is that the female characters in a Shakespeare play are always played by young boys. So it kind of enhances this uncanniness, this creepiness, because they are actually boys dressed up as women, pretending to be women, but also pretending to kind of not be women. So it actually kind of works in Shakespeare's favour, because it creates this middle ground where you're not sure what they are and you can't quite get a grasp on them, which to Shakespeare's audience is quite frightening. You can contrast this with modern interpretations, because nowadays we have very, very different ideas on gender, or most of us do, about, the appropriacy of changing gender or being androgynous, which means not actually looking like you belong to a certain gender. Androgynous means you're kind of in the middle, like it's difficult to tell whether you're male or female. Most of us don't have an issue with this in modern society, and we're quite interested in that idea of gender fluidity, or the fact that people can change, or that gender's not as much of a fixed construct. But in Shakespeare's time, it definitely was. So when you analyse this, you have to analyse it on the level of somebody experiencing the play in the time of Shakespeare. And for Shakespeare's time, this is quite frightening and quite confusing and not very commonly experienced or expressed. So yeah, they're very frightening figures in Shakespeare's day. They speak in a different meter, different rhythm, which is really important as well. So Shakespeare writes actually in poetry, not just in normal writing, because he's a double genius. So he not only writes plays, he also writes those plays in the form of a poem. And with poetry, you have meter. So most of the characters speak in something we call iambic pentameter, which imitates natural speech. So it sounds almost natural when you're listening to it, but it does still have a poetic rhythm. And the witches speak in a totally different meter from everyone else in the play, which just enhances their spookiness, their difference. They speak in this thing called trochaic trimeter, which is a very different rhythm to the normal iambic pentameter. So if you look back over the witches' scenes, you should try and look out for that, the way that they're speaking and how that's different. And they use a lot of rhyming couplets, like they just naturally speak in rhyme all the time, which is again kind of creepy and magical and very unnatural. So this enhances the idea that they're instruments of darkness. I really love this quote and I use it a lot, instruments of darkness. So this means that evil works through them, that darkness almost plays through these characters as if they're a musical instrument. They encourage lots of emotions or states of being that Shakespeare would have regarded as evil. So revenge, suffering, ambition, power, disaster. And they prey on the evil aspects of human nature. So they take power from manipulating humans into being more evil. So they push Macbeth and indirectly Lady Macbeth to evil actions, which causes a lot of negativity in the world. It ends up with good characters being killed or fleeing the country. So they enact evil through those characters. It's almost like Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are puppets, and the witches are trying to kind of sort out the mechanisms of the world via these characters. So if we're selfish, if we're afraid of stuff, if we have desires like the desire for power, these are all aspects of our human character that can be manipulated by evil. And Shakespeare's making the point through the witches that we have to be in control of these aspects of our human nature, because otherwise we leave them susceptible to evil. So he makes messages and he makes points through the characters and through the way that the story works. So you have to be really sensitive to those messages to make sure that you can kind of analyze properly in an essay. So one message is, if you leave yourself open to evil, then you're going to be corrupted and you're going to spread evil through the world rather than goodness. It's a good, powerful little message, I think. I definitely, I think I personally believe in that as well. That you should, if you do good, you kind of spread good in the world, and if you do bad, you spread badness in the world. So you should always try and do good. It's kind of a good little tip for life. So, so anyway, that's a slight digression. The witches concoct potions. They make potions and predictions about the future. This predictions about the future again links them to these figures of the fates in Greek mythology that I was talking about at the beginning. And all these predictions seem to come true, but we don't know, and this is really crucial, we don't know if they make them true or if they just see them in the future and they say that that's what they see. So we don't know how much agency they have, how much capacity they have to actually enact on the world. Are they just having visions of what really happens, or are they actually changing future events through their prophecies? So do they observe fate, or can they actually into kind of what's the word, intercede and change people's fates? It's a really interesting question, and that's the type of tension that is good to explore in an essay. So this next point, I've kind of scrolled up a little bit. I've sort of touched on this already, but it's good to reinforce it because it's very important that you always focus in essays on audience interpretation. We want to reinforce, kind of hammer home that they're mysterious to the audience. We're not supposed to fully understand them. So again, you can make this kind of point in the essay that Shakespeare deliberately makes it very difficult to fully understand the witches because they're not human, they're magical, they're superhuman, they're evil. We're not supposed to identify with them or fully understand what they're doing or how much influence they have. We're just meant to be repulsed by them and to be warned against, against the things that they encourage, like ambition and power and pride and that kind of thing. So they're mysterious to the audience, and they would have been genuinely frightening because people were very much interested in and believed in witches in the time. And again, in the context lesson for the Macbeth course, I go into this in a lot of detail, so have a look there for more information on people's response to witches in the time. But King James himself was very into witches, and actually the scene in Macbeth where the witches are going on about making a shipwreck and being annoyed by a sailor is a direct reference, like a nod to what happened to King James, because he was in a shipwreck and he was convinced that witches had done it. They'd sent the storm to try and kill him. It's quite interesting, and it shows you just how much people genuinely believe that witchcraft is real in this time. So they're really frightening to the audience at Shakespeare's time. I mean, they're kind of creepy and entertaining and probably quite frightening to a modern audience still, but they were triple scary in the actual day that they were written because people fully believed in witchcraft. So it's a historical belief, and you can talk about the difference between a modern and a contemporary interpretation there, which again gets you this kind of tension. So the next one is a structural point. Macbeth only meets the witches twice, but they appear more than that in the play, and they're the first characters that we encounter in Act 1, Scene 1. So they sort of frame the play, they start it off. And yeah, it's an important thing to kind of think about, that we see a lot more of what they're doing than Macbeth does, because that influences our interpretation of them. So you can make some interesting kind of structural points about that, the amount of times Macbeth sees them versus the amount of times the audience sees them, and how it creates a kind of dramatic irony, because we know more about them than the characters do. Dramatic irony is another really good technique that's considered high level to talk about in an essay. So the last 2 points then. They provide the inciting incident for Macbeth. An inciting incident is the thing that makes the character start doing what he or she is doing, and kind of it sets all of the events in motion, basically, for the play. So without the witches, he would probably just be, on his merry way, happily trudging through the moorland with Banquo after the death of the traitor. And he'd just be kind of happy with that and content. There wouldn't be any doubt in his mind that he needed to climb higher or kill any king or anything like that. He would just be happy with his own position in life. So when he bumps into the witches, his mind changes, his will changes. So they're the inciting incident. They're the thing that changes that. And even though they don't ever speak to Lady Macbeth, they indirectly affect her too. So she hears about their evil doings from Macbeth, and then she gets inspired by that and embraces evil herself. So they have this indirect effect through the world as well, and that's really important that you're aware of that when you analyze their characters, that they don't necessarily have to speak to someone directly or be actively involved in anything to actually have a lot of power and control over the way things pan out. So they have indirect influence via other characters that extend the sphere of darkness. And that's really important as a message for how good versus evil works in the world. So finally, true to my promise, I will talk very briefly about Hecate. So unless you get an extract with Hecate, I wouldn't necessarily recommend talking about her. You maybe can. It shows that there's a hierarchy of evil. So the witches, no matter how powerful they seem to humans, they're actually very weak compared to the goddess of witchcraft, Hecate. So she appears in the middle of the play to have a go at the witches for being kind of silly and wasting their time with Macbeth. So some people actually think she's not really, she wasn't originally written in by Shakespeare, and those scenes with her were added afterwards because they're a bit weird the way she talks. You'll kind of notice if you read through those scenes. But basically, she's like the Grand High Witch, and she has more control over the witches and over the evil than they do. And she's kind of annoyed that they're off manipulating Macbeth by themselves, and she's also annoyed that they're not really doing it right. So she gives them a bit more guidance on how to enact further evil and further torture on Macbeth. And they take her guidance, and that's why they meet him in that cave with that cauldron in 4.1. So that's her influence on the play. So she's even more indirectly evil than the witches because no one even knows about her. None of the humans know about her, but she answers, or the witches answer to her, and they kind of enact her will, her evil bidding on the world. And then they manipulate human characters like puppets, and that allows evil to spread. It's really important the way that you can kind of visualize that, because Shakespeare's sort of exploring the way that he sees good and evil as working as tensions within the world, and especially within politics. So, hopefully you enjoyed this lesson. I really like witches, so I'm just happy to natter about them forever, really. I don't know why. I just always found them really interesting, and I studied Macbeth at GCSE as well, and I really liked the witches were always my favourite bit to analyse. So yeah, hopefully you really enjoyed this lesson. Have a look at my other character lessons and the general Macbeth course that we've made on Scribbly if you want more help on it. And yeah, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you guys soon.